Hello and welcome to BYJU'S IAS. Let's take up the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper by looking at an article from the front page of the Delhi edition. This article deals with the ongoing border tensions between India and China. After nearly 2 months of tense military standoff between the two countries, it appears that finally both the countries are taking a step towards disengagement, and initial reports indicate that China has pulled back its troops by a few kilometers from the disputed Galwan site, where violent clashes took place between the two sides just a few weeks ago. This disengagement has been made possible after a high-level interaction took place involving the special representatives of both the sides. This de-escalation and the pullback of the Chinese troops has taken place immediately after talks were held under the Special Representative Mechanism, or also known as the SR mechanism. After multiple rounds of talks at the level of senior military commanders failed to work out a solution, both the governments decided to invoke the SR mechanism. As soon as the special representatives met and worked out a possible solution, the Chinese PLA has started pulling back its troops by a couple of kilometers, and it has even started dismantling temporary structures such as tents that the PLA had pitched at the disputed site. See, the special representative mechanism was established in 2003 when then Prime Minister Vajpayee visited China, and the primary mandate of the SR mechanism was to work out a solution for the border dispute and to resolve the boundary issue by drawing up a political solution that was acceptable to both the sides. So accordingly, both the countries appointed their special representatives, and India chose to appoint its national security advisor as the special representative, and China appointed its state councillor as the special representative. Since then, the special representatives have met multiple times, and around 22 rounds of negotiations have been held till date. Through the special representative mechanism, both the sides managed to work out a framework agreement for resolving the border dispute in 2005, and this framework agreement laid down the political principles and guiding factors which would govern any border negotiations in the future. Over the years, these talks under the special representative mechanism have made considerable progress, even though the process has been disrupted time and again due to frequent border tensions and standoffs between the two countries. But despite the disruption, the SR mechanism has emerged as a very important channel of communication between the two countries, involving senior functionaries at the very highest levels of both the governments. Such a high-level interaction between the two sides has provided a platform to resolve and de-escalate from such crisis situations. Of late, the special representatives have even tried to widen their mandate. The special representatives have even held a special economic dialogue in order to strengthen and diversify economic relations between the two countries. So this high-level channel of communication was invoked by both India and China in order to work out a solution for the current standoff at the Galwan Valley. Immediately after India's National Security Advisor Ajit Doval met with China's State Councillor Wang Yi, a disengagement process seems to have been worked out, and accordingly, the Chinese PLA has started pulling back its troops by a couple of kilometers, and it has even started dismantling the temporary structures that it had erected at the clash site. But the beginning of the disengagement process does not mean that the crisis is over, because even before the June 15th clash that led to the killing of 20 Indian soldiers, a disengagement process had been agreed upon between India and China during talks held at the level of senior military commanders as per established protocols and agreements. As per the commitments made during these negotiations, China initially began the disengagement process, and it even began to pull back some of its troops. But within a few days, China strengthened its positions and its claims over the Galwan Valley, leading to these deadly clashes that resulted in the death of 20 Indian soldiers. So India will have to be cautious, and it cannot assume that China would be upholding all its commitments. The reason why China always appears to go back on its commitments is because both the countries have a completely different perception of each other's claims and the ground realities. These differing perceptions can be clearly brought out if you look at the statement that has been issued by India and China immediately after the talks between the special representatives took place. See, India has welcomed the progress that has been made at the SR talks, and it has called for a step-by-step phased de-escalation leading to complete disengagement. The Indian statement makes it very clear that both the sides need to respect the sanctity of the line of actual control and restore status quo. India has called upon both the countries to work towards restoring peace and tranquility and refrain from taking any unilateral action that could further increase tensions. In contrast, if you look at the Chinese statement, even though its foreign ministry has welcomed the beginning of the disengagement process, it appears to reaffirm its position on the Galwan Valley, and it has reiterated its commitment to safeguard all its territorial claims. And interestingly, the Chinese statement does not make any reference to restoring the status quo and for respecting the sanctity of the line of actual control. The Chinese statement even goes on to say that there is a need to avoid amplifying differences and complicating matters any further, which is basically a reference to India's questioning of China's claims over the Galwan Valley. Through the addition of this statement, China appears to indicate that it was India which amplified the differences and complicated the matters, leading to the military standoff, and hence it appears that China is seeking to place the responsibility on India for the current escalation in tensions. India's former Foreign Secretary Shyam Saran says that these differing statements from China indicates the true intentions of China and also the differing perceptions of both the sides with regard to each other's claims and the ground realities. So hence, he is asking the Indian government to be cautious and not assume that the beginning of the disengagement process would translate into a complete resolution of the crisis. Because there is still no guarantee from the Chinese side that the status quo which existed prior to the standoff would be restored. The same argument is made by Suhasini Haidar as well in this article on page number 10. She calls upon the government of India to learn a lesson from the Doklam de-escalation of 2017. The manner in which the Doklam dispute was resolved has shown us that disengagement and de-escalation is just not enough, but what is needed is the restoration of status quo ante, or the restoration of the situation that existed before the standoff began. So this means that any agreement to disengage and de-escalate should clearly define the withdrawal line, and it has to be ensured that the Chinese troops withdraw to the pre-standoff positions. See, during the Doklam dispute, it has been noticed that the de-escalation that was worked out during the Wuhan informal summit between Prime Minister Modi and President Xi Jinping did end the tensions, but it did not put a halt to the road construction activities of the PLA in Bhutanese territory. The root cause of the Doklam dispute was the objection of both India and Bhutan to the road construction activities of the PLA in what is claimed as Bhutanese territory. This objection raised by India and Bhutan led to a serious military standoff between India and China, but even though the Wuhan informal summit managed to de-escalate these tensions, the Chinese PLA failed to restore status quo, and they in fact went ahead with the road construction activities. And over the last 2 years, that is between 2018 to 2020, most of the road construction activities has been completed by the PLA, giving it a tactical advantage at the strategic Doklam plateau that is located at the tri-junction of India, Bhutan and China. So in a way, China appears to have strengthened and consolidated its position, and this basically shows that China is following a set pattern, or it is basically establishing a precedent with each incident. Strategic experts point out that China is following a well-established pattern to challenge the existing status quo and enhance its claims against India. First, China begins by challenging the existing status quo at a given location by deliberately violating the sanctity of the LAC through border incursions, and then escalating the crisis further by making new territorial claims which essentially challenges the existing status quo. Then after a prolonged standoff which might last a few weeks or a few months, China knows very well that India would be looking to disengage and de-escalate, and that's when China opens up to negotiations. And even though these talks lead to a disengagement and a de-escalation, it will end up helping China to consolidate its hold over the newly held areas, thereby effectively changing the status quo itself. So basically, this strategy of China to violate, escalate, disengage and then consolidate the position is effectively changing the status quo in China's favor. So in this context, strategic experts are calling upon the government of India to draw lessons from the Doklam de-escalation and be cautious with regard to the ongoing disengagement process. They are asking the Indian government to not just settle for disengagement, but instead push China to completely restore status quo as it existed before the standoff began. Now let's take up another article from page number 1, which possibly provides evidence to indicate whether the SARS coronavirus 2 is airborne. See, a group of 239 scientists from around 32 countries have written a letter to the World Health Organization urging it to examine the current evidence available, which indicates that COVID-19 could be airborne. See, our current understanding of COVID-19 and how it spreads is based on what the WHO has told us. The World Health Organization has time and again denied that COVID-19 is an airborne disease, and it has said that the primary route through which the SARS coronavirus 2 has been spreading is through respiratory droplets. That is, when an infected patient coughs or sneezes, they expel large mucus droplets containing the virus, which drop quickly to the floor and the nearby surfaces. Based on this understanding, the WHO has advised governments to devise a containment strategy that minimizes our contact with high contact areas such as doorknobs, tables at restaurants and offices, high contact areas in public transportation, etc. So to minimize our contact with such high risk and high contact areas where the respiratory droplets might have accumulated, governments have designed a containment strategy that is based on social distancing, on the mandatory wearing of masks while outdoors, and adopting behavioral changes such as frequent hand washing, sanitization and disinfection of high contact areas, etc. But these scientists have warned the WHO that it has been ignoring available evidence which could indicate that COVID-19 is indeed airborne. According to these scientists, the WHO has chosen to ignore the fact that when we cough and sneeze, we not only expel droplets, but we also expel small tiny aerosols that are usually less than 5 microns in size. Studies conducted by these scientists has shown that these aerosols can carry the coronavirus, and since they are extremely small in size, they can easily stay afloat in the atmosphere, and they can even glide along with the wind current and infect the nearby people when they inhale air, thereby significantly enhancing the risk of exposure. These findings have been brought out by the scientists by studying how crowded indoor events have turned into super spreader events. Because these tiny aerosol particles can easily stay afloat, especially in indoor settings, and in crowded indoor areas such as restaurants, pubs, offices, and religious places, the indoor ventilation system can easily spread the virus along. And according to this group of scientists, this is how crowded indoor events have turned into super spreader events around the world. See, experts have pointed out that the WHO currently doesn't recognize this evidence because of its outdated definition of airborne transmission. See, currently, the WHO classifies only those diseases as airborne where the pathogen can travel over long distances through air, such as the measles virus. This outdated definition of airborne transmission of the WHO does not take into account the possibility of airborne transmission in crowded indoor settings. Hence, this group of scientists have submitted their evidence to the WHO, and they have urged the WHO to consider the possibility of airborne transmission of COVID-19, especially in indoor settings, and suitably revise its guidelines in order to update the containment strategy as well. Because if the transmission is happening through the air in indoor settings, then the ventilation and air conditioning systems will have to be completely remodeled in order to minimize the recirculation of air, and they will have to be fitted with new powerful filters. If airborne transmission of COVID-19 is conclusively proven, then it would require us to compulsorily wear masks even in indoor settings where social distancing is already being practiced. In that case, the containment strategy has to be revised and updated, and maybe even N95 masks will have to be made mandatory in indoor settings, especially for healthcare workers. Now let's take up a column from page number 6, written by Chinmaya Garekan, a former Indian diplomat. In this column, the writer talks about the role of national interests in defining a country's foreign policy. See, students of political science and IR would know that The realist school of thought of international relations believes that foreign policy is nothing but the pursuit of a country's national interests or self-interests. Students of the realist school of thought have always believed that in foreign policy, pursuing the self-interests of a country should always take priority over ideology and moral values. That's the reason why the pursuit of national interests is often referred to as the pursuit of selfish interests. And a foreign policy that has been designed to solely achieve these national interests by keeping aside ideological inclinations and moral compulsions is referred to as realpolitik. Now the question is, what goals of foreign policy fall under the definition of national interests? See, the national interests of a country could range from securing its territorial sovereignty, defending its national security, promoting economic ties through close trade and commerce relations, ensuring the well-being of its diaspora, engaging in cultural diplomacy in order to enhance and project its soft power. It could also include securing and diversifying its energy security, promoting its goals of environmental conservation, etc. So any of these goals could fall under the definition of a country's national interests. So now the question is, who gets to define the national interests of a country, and does it remain static or does it remain constant? The realist school of thought has always recognized that national interests are dynamic in nature. They do not remain static and they constantly evolve, and it is always defined by the government of the day. See, even though some of the larger goals remain the same, the specific targets and objectives are defined based on the perception of the government of the day. In the case of India, it is the Prime Minister who takes the lead role in defining the national interests of the country, because the setup of the Indian polity is such that it is the Prime Minister who is personally seen as the driving force behind the country's foreign policy. This statement holds true from 1947 to till date, and all the Prime Ministers have contributed in their own way to defining India's national interests. The writer presents several instances to show how Indian Prime Ministers have wholeheartedly pursued India's national interests by keeping aside their own ideological biases. See, whether their pursuit of national interests was a success or a failure is a different question altogether, and it is only right in a democratic society to hold the concerned Prime Minister accountable for their failures as well. The writer argues that, irrespective of the outcome of their foreign policies, all Prime Ministers seek to pursue India's national interests, that is defined on the basis of the existing circumstances of the day. Be it Nehru's policy towards Pakistan or his mistake of trusting China, they were all driven with the objective of protecting and promoting India's national interests of the day. The same can be said about Indira Gandhi's policies towards China, Pakistan, the United States, the Soviet Union, or the way in which P.V. Narasimha Rao handled India's foreign policy in a post-Cold War era, or the manner in which Vajpayee dealt with Pakistan and China and reached out to the United States, or how Manmohan Singh opened a new chapter in India-US relations and prioritized nuclear diplomacy and trade diplomacy. The same argument holds true for Prime Minister Modi's pursuit of India's national interests as well. Be it the manner in which his government has prioritized neighboring countries, or how the diaspora has been made an integral part of India's foreign policy, or how the government has dealt with the challenges posed by Pakistan and China. Whether these policies are a success or a failure, you will always find that Indian Prime Ministers tend to pursue a foreign policy that is free from their personal ideological biases, with the sole objective of protecting and promoting India's national interests. Now let's take up a column from page number 7, which pays tribute to P.C. Mahalanobis. See, just a few days ago, we took up a practice question under which we spoke about the contribution of P.C. Mahalanobis to Indian statistics, and we discussed the significance of statistics to socio-economic planning. So this column is just an extension of this discussion, so I would request you to go through the column once. Now let's take up a column from page number 7, which identifies the two biggest threats to public health in the middle of the ongoing pandemic. The writer says that rampant air pollution and emission of greenhouse gases, accompanied with a weak public health care system, are the two biggest threats to public health care, especially in the middle of the pandemic. Even though the pandemic and the resultant lockdown has considerably brought down pollution levels across the world, we cannot ignore the fact that air pollution single-handedly contributes to a number of chronic diseases and premature deaths around the world. Studies indicate that air pollution alone leads to around 9 million premature deaths per year globally. The writer even tries to establish a possible connection between regions that suffer from very high pollution, such as China, New York, Delhi, Mumbai, etc., and their vulnerability to register a higher morbidity and mortality rate for COVID-19. Even though there are a number of other factors that contribute to COVID-19 death rates, the writer tries to say that excessive air pollution could be one of the contributing factors. He points to air pollutants such as particulate matter, especially PM 2.5, that is known to cause a variety of respiratory disorders that could turn out to be fatal when there is prolonged exposure to the pollutant. The writer says that cities and countries suffering from very high pollution could witness a significantly higher death rate for COVID-19 as well. Then he points out how the emission of greenhouse gases such as carbon dioxide and methane contribute towards global warming, and studies have already established that global warming is directly responsible for intensifying extreme weather events and natural disasters such as cyclones, heat waves, floods, etc. So according to the writer, uncontrolled air pollution and excessive emission of greenhouse gases accompanied with a weak healthcare system, especially in the public sector, are the two biggest threats for public health in the coming years. So the writer is calling upon the governments to make use of the opportunity provided by the pandemic and the subsequent lockdown to rebuild a new economy and envision a reformed industrial model that can effectively tackle air pollution and the emission of greenhouse gases. He says that the pandemic and the lockdown is an opportunity for governments to transform the way public transportation operates and to promote the large-scale adoption of electric vehicles. Along with this, if governments increase their healthcare spending and if they provide for universal healthcare facilities, then a strong public healthcare system can be built, which would keep us prepared for the next emerging health crisis. He points out how most countries, including India, are unprepared to deal with the next biggest disaster by referring to India's ranking in the Global Health Security Index of 2019. So this column brings out the urgency with which we need to confront the challenges posed by air pollution and greenhouse gas emissions, and how important it is to build a strong public healthcare system in order to ensure that we are prepared adequately for the next health crisis. Now let's take up an article from page number 11, which refers to the World Drug Report that is brought out by the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. We have covered some of the findings of this report over the last couple of weeks, and according to today's article, the World Drug Report places India in the top 5 list of countries as far as opium seizures are concerned. Data from the report also points out the two major hubs for opium production, that is the Golden Crescent region and the Golden Triangle region. The Golden Crescent refers to Afghanistan, Pakistan and Iran that are located on India's western borders, and the Golden Triangle region refers to Myanmar, Thailand and Laos that are located on India's eastern borders. Since India is sandwiched between the two major opium producing hubs of the world, it has emerged as a major transit country and as well as a market for opium and other derived products. Data from the report also shows that the major markets for opium and related products exist in the United States and in Western Europe. Now let's take up the practice questions for today. Which of the following statements are correct? The construction of Qutub Minar was begun by Qutbuddin Aibak and completed during his rule. Along with features of Parso-Arabic architecture, features of Nagari architecture can also be found at the Qutub complex. Amongst the given statements, the first statement is incorrect, so option B is the right answer. See, the construction of Qutub Minar was indeed begun by Qutbuddin Aibak, but he constructed only the lower levels of the Qutub Minar, and its construction was completed by Iltutmish, Firoz Shah Tughlaq and later by Sher Shah Suri. The Qutub complex, which has been designated as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, does have features of both Parso-Arabic architecture along with Nagari architecture, which is a feature of Hindu temples. This question has been asked because on page number 1, the Hindu carries an article that refers to the reopening of national monuments, including the Qutub complex located in New Delhi. Now let's take up the next practice question. Zardozi Art refers to a type of heavy and elaborate metal embroidery on a silk, satin or velvet fabric base patronized by the Mughals, an architectural feature seen in all monuments built during the Mughal era, a painting style seen in medieval Persia, later popularized in India under the Mughals, a sculpture art seen in the Deccan Plateau, which enjoyed the royal patronage of the Bahmani Sultanate. The correct answer is option A. Zardozi art refers to a type of elaborate metal embroidery that is done on various types of fabric, including silk, satin and velvet. This art form was patronized by the Mughals, especially by Akbar. In India, Zardozi art is still practiced in a number of cities, including Lucknow, Bhopal, Chennai, etc. And the Lucknowi Zardozi art has also been given the GI tag. Apart from India, this art form is still practiced in a number of Middle Eastern countries and as well as in Central Asia. This question has been asked because we have an article on page number 11 which refers to the impact of demonetization and the pandemic on the livelihoods of Zardozi artists in Bhopal. Now let's take up the next practice question. Which of the following statements are correct? A virtual private network or VPN extends a private network across a public network and enables users to send and receive data across shared or public networks as if their computing devices were directly connected to the private network. VPN technology was developed to provide access to corporate applications and resources to remote or mobile users and to branch offices. Internet users may secure their connections with a VPN to circumvent geo-restrictions and censorship or to connect to a proxy server in order to protect personal identity and location, which enables them to stay anonymous on the internet. All the three statements are correct. Option D is the right answer. This question has been asked because we have an article on page number 12 which refers to how VPN technology has enabled corporate firms to extend secure work from home options during the pandemic. Now let's take up the next practice question. Which of the following statements are correct? Bubonic plague is one of the three types of plague caused by bacterium Yersinia pestis. Plague is classified into three types: bubonic plague, septicemic plague and pneumonic plague based on the route of infection. It is mainly spread by the bite of an infected flea or occasionally by an infected mammal. Vaccines are available and considered to be very effective. Amongst the given statements, the fourth statement is incorrect. See, plague is an infectious disease caused by bacterium Yersinia pestis. It is classified into three types based on the route of the infection, that is based on the route through which the bacteria infects the human body. If it enters the lymph nodes, then it is referred to as bubonic plague. If it infects the bloodstream, then it is referred to as septicemic plague. And if it infects the lungs, then it is referred to as the pneumonic plague. All the three types of plagues are highly fatal, and it is primarily spread by the bite of a flea that has been infected by biting other animals such as rats, rodents, cats, etc. In the 14th century, the pandemic that spread across Asia, Africa and Europe, which led to the death of more than 50 million people, is considered to have been caused by plague, and it is also referred to as the Black Death. But even though a few vaccines have been developed, they are not considered to be very effective. But in today's world, a plague epidemic is considered to be highly unlikely because we have a number of antibiotics that are considered to be very effective in treating the infection. So amongst the given statements, 1, 2 and 3 are correct. So option B is the right answer. This question has been asked because according to this article on page number 14, a bubonic plague outbreak has been reported in China. Now let's take up the next practice question. The Magnitsky Act, which is often in news, refers to a law passed by the US Congress to impose environmental costs on polluting industries, a US law that authorizes the US government to sanction those who it sees as human rights offenders, freeze their assets, and ban them from entering the US, a European law mandating social media and technology firms to share revenue with original content creators, a law passed by the British Parliament to complete the Brexit process. The correct answer is option B. See, the Magnitsky Act was passed by the US Congress in 2012 and it became a law after receiving the assent of the then President Obama. This legislation was brought in to primarily impose sanctions against Russian officials who were responsible for the death of a Russian tax official who had exposed corruption within the Russian government. So the objective of this act was to empower the US government to impose sanctions against those who it sees as human rights offenders and freeze their economic assets and ban them from entering the United States. Initially, this legislation focused only on Russia, but in 2016, the mandate of the act has been expanded, and this gives the US government a global reach to impose sanctions against officials of any autocratic country that it considers as offenders of human rights. Based on the Magnitsky Act of the United States, the United Kingdom has also passed a similar legislation which allows the UK government to impose a similar set of sanctions. This question has been asked because according to this article on page number 14, the United Kingdom has decided to impose new human rights sanctions against officials and organizations belonging to Russia, Saudi Arabia and North Korea. Now let's take up a practice question from the 2016 prelims paper. There has been a persistent deficit budget year after year. Which action or actions of the following can be taken by the government to reduce the deficit? Reducing revenue expenditure, introducing new welfare schemes, rationalizing subsidies, reducing import duty. See, 2 and 4 are clearly incorrect because introducing new welfare schemes will increase the expenditure of the government and reducing import duty will bring down the revenue. So these two actions cannot be taken if the deficit has to be brought down. But reducing revenue expenditure and rationalizing subsidies will definitely help in controlling the deficit, and hence option C is the correct answer. Finally, let's take up a couple of mains practice questions. The first question, what lessons can India draw from the resolution of the Doklam dispute that can be applied for resolving the dispute with China at the Galwan river valley? The second question, national interests are dynamic. Identify the dynamic nature of national interests in the contemporary world polities with suitable examples. Kindly write an answer to these questions and post your answers in the comment section below. So this concludes our discussion for the day. Thanks for watching.